Good evening. In their coverage of the Middle East, going back many years to the Gulf War, the bombing of Iraq and the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, the series of conflicts and wars in Lebanon, the crisis in Egypt, the war in Syria, the continuing attacks on civilians in the occupied Palestinian territory, the civil war in Yemen, to the war in Gaza. Much of the mainstream Western media ended up spreading a lot of misconceptions, myths, and mistruths. What did news consumers in the West miss about the war in Gaza, the turmoil in Lebanon, Syria, Afghanistan, and elsewhere? How can we ensure better coverage of the raging conflicts that are shaping our world? I'm Jim Turk, the director of the Center for Free Expression, and this evening we have an impressive panel of international journalists and Middle East experts who will address these important questions. Before I introduce them, though, I want to acknowledge that the land on which I'm speaking to you tonight is the traditional territory of many nations: the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's panel, the Canadian Association of Journalists and PEN Canada. And now our panel. Our first panelist is Hadeel Al-Shalchi. She is a reporter and editor with NPR News who has spent almost 15 years covering the Middle East and most recently covered the war in Gaza from Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. In 2024, she was amongst the first Western journalists to enter Damascus after the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. Prior to joining NPR, Hadeel was a Middle East correspondent for the Associated Press and covered the Arab Spring from Tunisia, Bahrain, Egypt, Syria, and Libya. In 2012, she joined Reuters as the Libya correspondent. Welcome, Hadeel.
It's nice to meet you. Thank you.
Our second panelist is Mohamad Bazzi. Mohamad is director of the Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies and an associate professor of journalism at New York University. Before joining the NYU faculty, he was Middle East bureau chief at Newsday from 2003 to 2008. He was the lead writer on the Iraq War and its aftermath. He also covered the 2000 Palestinian uprising, the war in Afghanistan, and the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel. He previously served as Newsday's United Nations bureau chief and as a Metro reporter in New York City. His essays and commentaries on the Middle East have appeared in the New York Times, the London Review of Books, Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, The Nation, The Guardian, The Washington Post, and other publications. He's won numerous awards for his journalism. Welcome, Mohamad.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
Our third panelist is Martin Lukacs. Martin is a Canadian investigative journalist based in Montreal and managing editor of The Breach. Previously, he was a writer for The Guardian and has written for the New York Review of Books, the Toronto Star, the Walrus, CBC, and other Canadian publications. He's also the author of The Trudeau Formula, Seduction and Betrayal in the Age of Discontent, and co-editor of a book entitled When Genocide Wasn't News, How Canadian Media Covered Up the Destruction of Gaza. Welcome, Martin.
Thanks for having me. And hopefully my video will come on shortly.
I'm sorry?
Can you guys see my video? Because I can't.
No, I can't see you.
All right, I'll sort that out.
Okay,
Sorry about that.
But you have a minute. So our fourth panelist is Ari Paul. Ari is a journalist in New York City who is a regular contributor to FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. He has covered politics for Haaretz, The Nation, The Guardian, Dissent, Jacobin, The New York Observer, Al Jazeera, English, Vice, amongst other publications. He's also been a lecturer at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Welcome, Ari.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And the moderator for this impressive group is an equally impressive journalist, and that's Julian Sher. Julian is a senior fellow at the Center for Free Expression. As an investigative journalist, he is the author of 8 books and was the senior producer of CBC's The Fifth Estate for 5 years. He has filmed documentaries in Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Israel. He won the Canadian Screen Award for Best Documentary for Ghosts of Afghanistan, which looked at the dangers of the Taliban. And he won the broadcast equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize, the DuPont Columbia Award, for a New York Times CBC documentary, Nuclear Jihad, that examined global terrorism and the nuclear bomb. Julian also trains journalists throughout the Middle East. Welcome, Julian.
Thanks a lot, Jim.
So for the audience, tonight we're going to have a very interesting conversation. As you're listening to it, we hope questions will come to mind, and we'll hope you ask these questions, because after the panel has its conversation for 45, 50, 55 minutes, we're going to turn to the audience for a question and answer session. And this version of Zoom that we use has a question and answer button. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little box with a question mark in it. It says Q&A. So anytime a question comes to mind as you're listening to the panel, just click on that box and write out your question. Don't wait till we turn to questions. Just record them as you think of them. And when Julian turns to the audience, he'll ask Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator of the Center for Free Expression, to read out the first question, which she will do, and then the audience will discuss it. We'll go to the second question. But really, this is an opportunity that most of us don't have to talk with such esteemed journalists and to ask questions that you may have on these matters. So we look forward to your participation in this discussion. That's all for me. So over to you guys.
Thanks a lot, Jim. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Martin, on camera. Look, obviously, given the dramatic events this past week, we've all been witnessing the joy and sadness of the return of the hostages in Israel, the Palestinians in Gaza facing the unimaginable challenge of rebuilding after 2 years of death and destruction. We're going to look at the Middle East in general, but obviously we will have to focus a lot on the war in Gaza. And I think it makes our panel tonight even more timely. I should stress that, as with previous panels we've done at the CFE on media freedoms, this is not a debate from different political sides of an issue that happens elsewhere. This is a chance for you, people who are watching, to hear from critics, observers, you've seen their CV, practitioners, to get their perspective, which a lot of you may have not heard about such a burning issue. So let's start right away. I want to ask each of you, what do you think are some of the worst examples of misconceptions, myths, mistruths about the wars and conflicts in the Middle East? Starting with you, Hadeel, because you've been in the field and now you're both an editor and consuming a lot of the legacy media. What strikes you looking back at your many years?
I think I don't have like exact examples, but I think that what we get wrong, or what the media can get wrong about the Middle East, is sort of believing that it's one big bubble of people that all believe the same thing, all think the same thing, all say the same things. That's one. I think one other thing that happens particularly that I saw in times of like the, in front lines or during the Arab Spring when things were moving really fast, is there's a lot of lazy journalism, talking to, we call it in the industry, taxi driver.
The taxi driver, yeah.
Taxi driver, and which, they actually, taxi drivers are great because they do get to see a lot of like the public, but it's considered lazy because you're getting in the car anyway. What do you think? And then that makes your story, as opposed to really trying to dive into communities and different people, different economic classes, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the idea that all the Middle East, and I'm talking about Arabs plus Israelis in that, in the war in Gaza, are all thinking the same way. And then also this combined with lazy journalism can give you some egregious stories, I think, that kind of can make you cringe even.
Interesting point. Through all my travels in the Middle East, I keep looking for an avenue called the Arab Street, right? But I can never find that particular street. Ari?
That's what people use. They're like, and the
That's
Arab
right.
Street says.
And the Arab Street. That's right. That's right. Ari Paul, what strikes you over the last couple of decades about some of the underlying flaws?
Well, I think one theme that I think has always been a part of Middle East reporting in the West and really has happened in the last 2 years is the abuse of the charge of anti-Semitism and the sort of kind of to borrow what Hadeel said, sort of painting with a broad brush as if there's just sort of like one Jewish opinion on all this. And one thing that I really monitored from the very early days of this conflict, when right after October 7th, was the way many newspapers in the U.S., especially the New York Times, which I think a lot of media in the U.S. kind of follow, of defining the leftmost position being Israelis who might have been protesting Netanyahu's judicial reforms are now behind Netanyahu and whatever he does, as if that to the right is all of Jewish opinion. And this was sort of started from those very early days when when the war was really ramping up, and you saw other versions of this when Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania wasn't tapped to be the vice presidential nominee for the Democrats. So all these pieces I think there were almost 3 or 4, both on the news and the opinion side of the New York Times, saying that it was because he was an observant Jew that he was getting all of this sort of doubt from the left, when it had nothing to do with his religiosity. There were plenty of religious Jews that they were fine with, that the left flank of the party was fine with. It was particularly his outspokenness about Palestine, and so that there is this sort of writing off of Jews who might have been anti-Zionist or critical of what was happening, and those protests being written out of the equation. So I think that, and then there was, I mean, it's a sort of a small example, but there was a high school in Los Angeles, a Jewish high school in Los Angeles, that forbade its students from interviewing Muslim people in their community about their opinions on what was happening. So there's a lot of stifling of the opinion about what the Jewish opinion is, and I think that really adds to this like decades old problem of the misuse of anti-Semitism.
Well, we just heard 2 interesting perspectives of this kind of the dangers of a monolithic approach. Mohamad, you have a real historical perspective and crossing many continents. What strikes you as some of the worst problems and misconceptions of the legacy media?
I'm going to focus. I'm going to take a slice of that, and in some ways actually continue with this theme of the monolithic view. I think one central aspect of this is legacy media most often privileging official sources, privileging government sources, privileging those sources that come with that official stamp of approval, as the most important sources, as the sources that get the most airtime, that get the most depth of coverage, and that tend to be challenged the least. And we see that most often, certainly with U.S. government sources, but with allied governments. We don't see Russia, China, Iran. We don't see those sources get the same benefit of the doubt that U.S. sources, that Israeli sources get. And in the most recent war in Gaza, we've seen I think a tremendous failure of journalism to question Israeli government sources and Israeli military sources and anything associated with those sources, to question them on their claims in the way that we would often see, for example, the most basic casualty figures in Gaza being challenged, because they come, a lot of news organizations began to attach the phrase the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza, even though we later learned that the Pentagon and others and often Israeli sources themselves relied on those figures. There's been a history of that ministry providing accurate figures for many years. We didn't see Likud run health ministry figures in Israel, and and the roots of that are complicated and go back to a central problem of modern journalism, and I'm thinking here modern journalism over decades of privileging those official sources, and having real and it having a real policy impact, where believing the top levels of the U.S. government ahead of the Iraq invasion in 2002, and sort of in the immediate post 9/11 aftermath, that got the U.S. into the war in Iraq, into that catastrophic war, and the years it took to undo the damage, both to the credibility of the U.S. government and to the credibility of the legacy media. But I mean, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of hope because I've seen these patterns repeat. I think we've all seen these patterns repeat in the last 2 years. We even saw the patterns repeat ahead of or during the the short Iran-Israel war over the summer.
Interesting. And I guess it's one thing when lazy media, as Hadeel say, do the same thing if you're covering a water spill in your own country, but people have the access to find other sources. When we're watching or listening to reports that quote officials in Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Israel, we don't have as much access to those alternate sources. And that's why your criticism raises a good point. Martin, what about you? What has bothered you the most about media coverage of the Middle East?
Julian, I would say for me, it's the double standards that pervade reporting in the West when it comes to a whole range of issues to do with the Middle East, but especially in the way that deaths are treated. So the way in which Israeli deaths are often treated with a depth of detail and humanization and outrage in media coverage, and by contrast, Palestinian deaths often covered in a way that would make it feel like it's keeping a lid on sympathy and anger. It trickles down to, as we've seen, I think, the use of passive construction. Palestinians often died, whereas Israelis were killed. And it's a kind of rampant sanitization, I think, of political violence that Palestinians have faced. In my country, Canada, the CBC, our public broadcaster, I think has actually made a unique contribution in explaining the mentality that underlies this in the upper echelons of media organizations. There was a reader that filed a complaint after noting that the CBC often used evocative and sympathy generating terms like murderous or vicious or brutal to refer to Hamas's attacks on Israeli civilians on October the 7th, but never used the same kind of language for the violence visited on Palestinians. And it was fascinating that in response to that complaint, the director of standards at the CBC wrote a very revealing response, which we document in this book. It's one of the chapters. And it turned out that the CBC is not only aware that they describe Israel's violence against Palestinians differently with more sanitized language, but that they consciously believe it's justified. So when it comes to Israelis' bombing of Gaza, the CBC said that they don't use terms like brutal and vicious, but they prefer terms like intensive or unrelenting or punishing. And the reason, the director of standards explained, is because Israel carries out its killings remotely instead of face to face. As if to say that incinerating an entire neighborhood or block of women, children, and men with a bomb or a missile is any less savage than killing civilians with a knife or a grenade. As if we in the West can describe the horror of an innocent civilian dying as if it were related to the comfort of the person delivering the violence. And I think we've seen this coverage continue even in the last weeks, as we've seen the disparities in coverage between how Palestinian hostages released from Israeli jails are covered as compared to Israeli hostages released by Hamas.
Fascinating. I hope people are seeing how each of these, our panelists, are giving you some rather different perspectives, not what you would necessarily expect, even if you were expecting criticisms. How do each of you feel, or not necessarily all of you? There's been dramatic developments this week. Do any of you feel there's been some good coverage of what's gone on in the last week? And do any of you feel that some of the criticisms you're raising we are seeing? Because clearly we are headed to an important turning point in the Middle East. What are some of your feelings of the coverage? Hadeel, you have to consume much more news than probably most of us because it's part of your job. What was your feeling? Were you a little more pleasantly surprised than you would have been?
I mean, I think that we have to also differentiate between the times of news and times of like maybe step back and analysis, and
Analysis.
etc. Right now has been the time of news. It's like things are moving really quickly. There have been some feature writing on the sides, etc. As a news person, I've been okay with the news. It's moving really quickly, and I think that we're getting as much information as we can with the resources that people on the ground over there have. I have to also admit that as a person who works and has worked for legacy media in the Middle East, a lot of the people who work for the legacy media over there are very good friends of mine, people I know personally. And I understand the challenges that they are facing in terms of access, resources, etc., time, but also editorial decision making, editorial pushback, etc. So just from even talking to them about their daily lives and in writing the news and reporting it, I feel like they're doing as well as they can with what they have. I have been impressed with some of the coverage in terms of tempering the ceasefire. Like, this is, the war has ended, but we don't know what's going to happen. Netanyahu is still talking about the military. This could start at any time again. I do like some of the Post did a very good piece on, well reported, I think, of Hamas's restructuring and not just from an angle of, oh, look, Hamas is coming back, but it's more like Israel knows that Hamas was going to come back. Israel understands the consequences of how Hamas is going to restructure. It's not doing this out of a vacuum. That it's playing a role in the fact that Hamas can return to some of these cities. And then I have also seen some social media posts, etc. Like the New York Times, for example, had a story where they tried to go back to some of the people that they've been reported, some Palestinians inside Gaza that they've been trying to report on, and to go back and see where they are. So I think that, again, we really need to remember that, and that a lot of journalists, there is really good criticism there, that we need to be critical of it. They are also shackled, and I felt this way also, shackled by the news needs, resources, access, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, yeah.
And maybe the media have learned some of the mistakes over the last 2 years and in previous wars, so they're trying to improve. Anybody else? The three gentlemen, your feelings? You, like all of us, have been glued to the TVs and social media and the newspapers. What were some of your feelings in the last week? Join in, anybody.
I think that some of the problems that Martin just laid out, I think, do have played out. I mean, I want to express something that Hadeel said, echo what Hadeel said, which is that there are many hardworking, brave journalists in legacy media. They're doing the work. I want to recognize their work, but sometimes when their copy comes to a desk, it can get changed, editorially, and I think it's important to make that distinction. But I see some of those problems that Martin had talked about. I mean, just a second ago, before we all logged on, there was a story. Well, there were several stories in the Times that that there are Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners, and that there is this lack of distinction between the people who were captured in Israel, the people in Israel, the Israeli hostages, some of them who were in fact civilians, and some of them who were in fact soldiers and military. And the fact that this is often thought of in the U.S. is, well, they were all just civilians, like they were all just taken innocently. So like there were a number of people online saying, why is this person who was a soldier who was captured from a tank called kidnapped? Why aren't they captured? That those types of little distinctions were coming out in the coverage. And there was another piece just a moment ago about Israeli families were very upset seeing some of the Palestinian prisoners being swapped over, saying, "Oh, well, they had done so many horrible things, and why is this happening?" When in a broader context, I mean, any ceasefire agreement or peace accords that we've seen going back several decades always involve some sort of amnesty and prisoner swaps, and that's just sort of an accepted part of this, and it's sort of written about as if this is some kind of twist of the knife of an unfair deal.
Yeah,
That's,
I mean, yeah,
Yeah, go ahead, Martin.
Just to echo and build off of Ari, and I completely take your point and Hadeel's point about the difficulties the frontline reporters face, and often the kind of filtering that happens when it works its way up the chain and hits the desk of editors. Yeah, I agree with everything Ari said, and I think it extends to the kind of humanized portrait that we receive of Israelis, which mind you, I have to underline, is the way that all innocent civilians should be depicted. With we learn about their families. They're described as fathers, sons. We learn about the hobbies that they had, how hard it was to live in tunnels. Whereas the Palestinian hostages, and I think they need to be called that because in almost all cases they are innocent. Are just kind of one-dimensional prisoners, even though none of them were charged with crimes, or many of them weren't charged with crimes, certainly the ones taken during the bombardment of Gaza. And, no one's talking in the media about the thousands of Palestinians who still remain in illegal captivity today. So do their lives not matter, even though just because they're in a dark cell in an Israeli dungeon rather than in a tunnel? So I think that divergent language and empathy that is afforded to Israeli Jews but not to Palestinians is, I think, a damning indictment of the West's continuing dehumanization of Palestinians.
To be fair, I mean, go ahead. Yeah, jump in,
I
Hadeel.
think that it kind of, like what Ari and Martin have said, they kind of go back to a little bit of what we were talking about before in terms of lazy journalism. And I think a lot of times when I say lazy, it's not just, like the easy kind of sources that you're going to talk to. A lot of times, and I've done realized this in my own reporting, is that a lot of the reporters who are doing the reporting or their editors don't actually understand the story well, and so I feel like sometimes they come with a preconception from their own readings, from their own writings, from their own educations, from the fact they've never visited the Middle East, they don't understand the language, and they'll be like, well, yeah, I mean, the hostages are all innocent, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not giving an excuse that they're ignorant, but there are a lot of ignorant editors. There are a lot of ignorant reporters who are on the ground in the Middle East that don't have the language, don't have the cultural skills, don't have, a sense or history of the politics of the region. And that also plays a role in the coverage that you read. And that's why I think understanding the background of the person who's reporting or is also important, and what they've written about, what they've how they've reported before, understanding what kind of access that they've had, what languages they speak. A lot of times a piece of mine will go up to an editor and they'll ask me the most basic questions about the Middle East. And I'll be like, how did you make it this far? How is it that you are taking care of my story? Where I have to explain to you some of the most basic things about, about even Hamas or the Israeli government, the Knesset even. I had somebody ask me, what is the Knesset? And I'm like, I can't believe you're editing me. And I think that is a plays a part in everything that we've said so far.
Well, Hadeel, your point leads me to the second big area I wanted to tackle, and to some degree, let's take a broader helicopter view, which is what are some of the underlying reasons? We've been looking at some of the recent things, but let's step back a bit. And what do you think are some of the underlying reasons for some of this poor coverage? And Hadeel, the question to you, you raised it. how big a role is it the simple fact of language? You know, that it's increasing, but many Western journalists are Western, unlike you, do not speak the language of the country they are trying to report on. The lack of how serious is that? What advantages do you have? And is this one of the reasons for the holes in our coverage?
I mean, absolutely. I think that like language in any country gives you a different kind of access to the story than if you're working through a translator or a fixer. But I would even go a step further. Like I have seen in my coverage, when we've been out and seeing, Western white people who do speak the language, who do speak Arabic fluently, they will still have a very different interaction with an Arab source, let's say. There's I always notice, and I've noticed this in my own reporting, in the region, I've always had a different kind of interaction with a source, with somebody, with a grieving mother or with a prisoner or any of that kind of thing, because they see me as an Arab. Also, they do feel at home, do feel at ease. They feel like they can trust me with their story. So I do know that some of my stories are, I would go as far as saying richer, maybe, because I do have that kind of, not only I don't just have the understanding of the words of the language, but I understand the nuances behind each word. I understand the body language of a person in the region. And so that gives me a big edge. But yes, if somebody can speak the language, but then also I think one of the underlying issues sometimes is that journalists will go with a lack of empathy for the story. They go because they're driven by ego or reportage, or they just want to be there. They want to maybe tell the story. They want to be part of the history. They don't really see the person who's in front of them, that grieving mother, the hostage, the whatever, as a person with feelings, somebody who deserves, whose voice. I don't think many journalists will hold the voice of the person that they are interviewing with respect, with empathy, with responsibility. And I think that's like that's I don't know what that, how you change that exactly. But then also I think one of the things that has shackled me in my reporting is news needs. The fact that it's all about social media now, and making sure that every radio story that I've done, I have to do an Instagram piece with it, and I have to do the digital, and then I'm also being asked to do it really quickly, and I have to do it within I have to tell the entire story of the Middle East in like 3 minutes and 45 seconds because there's no room on the shows or in the news. So I don't know. Those are like some things that come to my mind about like what pulls back good reporting.
Mohamad, give us an historical perspective, because you've covered the region, and now you teach and study it going back decades. How did the media cover and learn the lessons? How long did it take the media to learn the lessons of Afghanistan or Iraq? And are we beginning to see some of the same things when it comes to the war in Gaza?
So, I agree with a lot of what Hadeel pointed out as some of the root reasons. I think, and going back to some of what Martin pointed out, but I think the reasons are more systemic. I think there are individual journalists at play. There are individual cases of whether it's laziness, lack of knowledge. And I think my answer might have been different a few years ago than it is today. And maybe it's seeing the past 2 years of coverage and trying to think about that, and trying to think of it in the context of past failures. But I think it's systemic because the media has failed in and here when I speak of the media, I'm not talking about individual journalists, but as institutions, the failures are consistent and they're repeated, and so there hasn't really been a capacity to learn, institutionally at least. from failures because we've seen the dehumanization. You can go back to Afghanistan and Iraq and the way that the civilians are represented and dehumanized, and the way that certain lives are, as Martin put it, a lot more value is put on certain lives. But you can also go back. You go back to Vietnam. There are when you look at the press, the criticism of the Western, and especially the U.S. Press, and how it covered Vietnam. That was a huge driver, certainly for years. And as that buildup, as that war took hold in the U.S., and as even as it became more and more publicly unpopular, a lot of that dehumanizing and problematic coverage continued. And I think you had something similar in Iraq. We saw something similar in Afghanistan, and we've certainly seen it in Gaza. And I mean, not to be completely bleak and not to throw one's hands up, but a lot of it, I think, goes back to the corporate consolidation of media, the fact that so much of media is really not accountable to the communities it serves. And now we've seen an even bigger disconnect between the legacy media and its consumers. You see, and here I'm not going to talk about the individual journalists, but I'll say the gatekeepers, the sort of people at the top who throw their hands in the air and say, my God, there's disinformation, there's bad faith state actors all over the place. No one trusts the media anymore. No one trusts us because of these bad faith actors and because of these outside forces. And you sit there and you look at them and you think, well, are you not, maybe you're not, there's no sense of self-introspection here of how you've covered this war, how you've covered a genocide unfolding before your eyes in Gaza, and where most of the world can see primary sources, can see documentation from Palestinians themselves of the violence being visited on them. And you, as the media organizations, basically have minimized that. I'm saying that as the legacy media have minimized so much of that. And how can you not see a direct connection between the loss of trust and faith in legacy media and that performance over the past 2 years, when you've also had, when your very organizations had to deal, let's not even go back to Vietnam, go back to Afghanistan and Iraq, and the failures, the systematic failures of that coverage and not learning those lessons.
Mohamad, in those examples you cited, do you take any solace from the fact that maybe the timeline it takes for the media to begin to correct itself in its own way, however however it may not be complete? You look at the Vietnam War, it took arguably many years for serious questioning. Afghanistan, a few years, but the criticism started fairly soon. Iraq, it was even briefer. Right. And in Gaza, it's only been 2 years, but we began to see, and I'll raise some examples later, of some improvements in the coverage. So do you take any encouragement from that we've gone from years to maybe a couple of years or months, even though it's not perfect, right? Is there more self-reflection or self-correcting?
Maybe I see it less as self-reflection and more the compressed timeline is also just the fact of dealing with social media, the fact of dealing with other outlets out there, the fact of dealing that you no longer, as the legacy media, no longer has the kind of monopoly it did during Vietnam and Afghanistan, and to an extent Iraq. The Sunday shows that the Sunday TV shows are still important, but those shows that built up a lot of the public sentiment within the U.S. for sure, but elsewhere, but especially in the U.S., that built up public sentiment and support for the Iraq invasion. Those shows aren't as important today as they were 22, 23 years ago. So part of that is also just the loss of power and the loss of influence you had over your audience. I do hope, I think you're right, there's a pattern of some self-reflection, but where I see the problem repeating itself is despite the self-reflection, as we saw a lot of self-reflection after the Iraq War, we don't see the same lessons being put. I mean, you should be able to put those lessons into use. It's the same generation. We're not talking about 2 or 3 generations apart. You should be able to put those lessons into use now, before you get into the way you've covered Gaza in the last 2 years.
Before I go to Ari and Martin, you raised the Sunday talk shows. There was Margaret Sullivan in The Guardian quotes an article this week by Adam Johnson in The Nation. He looked at the coverage from October 8th, 2023 to this Sunday, last Sunday, October 5th, of 3 of the 4 major Sunday morning news shows in America, NBC, ABC, CNN. And, quote, not once did any of the bookers, producers, or hosts see fit to interview a single Palestinian or Palestinian American. I mean, we're talking 3 years. And he said, if you look at the breakdown over a 21-month period, including CBS, 1 Palestinian guest, 24 Israeli guests, 5 interviews with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and 84 by US officials, which goes to your point, Mohamad, of, officialdom. Martin, I think it was you who once said that there can be a current of anti-Semitism that sees the coverage as a result of a nefarious Israeli lobby, which is wrong, but that you see that as misguided because it misses the target.
Yeah, we're in an age when accusations of anti-Semitism are flung brazenly in so many cases, in particular by the Israeli government and the Israel lobby in our respective countries. But I have detected a current of anti-Semitism in how we analyze both American and Canadian foreign policy, and also the coverage in countries like ours. And I do think it is a very dangerous and damaging mistake to assume that the Israel lobby or the Israel government has a chokehold or a disproportionate influence on skewing that coverage. I think it gets it backwards. In fact, Israel, far from having, or the Israel lobby, far from having a chokehold, is actually a client state of the United States. And I think so much of the distortions in the media that we see follow from that. Israel has been a very effective servicer of the interests of the U.S. empire, and I think the pattern that has tended to ensue from that is that citizens of the state of Israel are seen as worthy victims, whereas Palestinians are not. They're unworthy victims. And I think this is not really an exception. It's part of a rule. So I think many of the structural problems that we see with coverage of Gaza illuminate the problems that we see in coverage in so many places in the world. So I think, when we speak about the victims of another client state of the United States, Saudi Arabia, we hear very little about the hundreds of thousands of Yemenis who died through Saudi and UAE bombardment, and also a human manufactured famine in that country. So I think in some cases, there are entire nations of people who are dehumanized, as I think we've seen with the Palestinians. In other cases, people are just disappeared from that map of news coverage. Another one that is close to my own heart is the reporting on Haitians. I've mostly followed Canadian media coverage of Haitians, but Haitians have been monstrified in the Canadian media. That is a nation of people who overthrew the shackles of French and American imperialism and have been paying it ever since. And they are regularly cast as a nation of people who cannot govern themselves, even though most of the chaos that has been fomented in that country has often been at the hands of the France, Canadian, and American governments. And so I think that the kind of systematic and systemic bias that Mohamad has referred to is hardly the privilege, the unfortunate privilege of Palestinians. I think colonized nations across the world continue to experience it.
Thank you for widening it out to geographically and politically. Hadeel, was that you?
Yeah, maybe just like when we talk about the systemic issues, and I think this is closer maybe to what Mohamad was saying, and then also back to the fact that I speak Arabic and all that kind of stuff. I do, I think it's important to bring up that even though there exist now probably more than before Arab journalists like myself who have Arab names, who speak the language. I think when I speak to my other Arab Western journalist friends, we do feel much more pressure to be balanced than a Western, than a white journalist. We feel much more under scrutiny than white journalists do who are covering the same story. I felt when I went to Israel, Palestine to cover the war in Gaza, I felt extreme pressure from both sides. From feeling like I needed to make sure that I did stories about Israelis, because otherwise, if I only focused on Palestinians or did too many Palestinian stories, oh, it's because she's an Arab. And then also from the other side, it's like, oh, Hadeel's an Arab. She's gone to cover the story. She's going to get it right. And so there's a lot of pressure put on Arab journalists, on brown journalists, and then also we're always seen as biased. Like if
Right, there's a presumed bias which is not imposed on other journalists.
Exactly. So like when my stories go to my editors, I am on the defensive. Like I'm waiting to make sure that I have all of my arguments in a row to argue my points. Whereas I know that if a white journalist wrote exactly the same what I had, they would get less scrutiny.
Ari, you're based in New York, and of course, New York is home to the New York Times, which is an amazingly influential newspaper. Talk a bit about the role you see the New York Times playing, both globally but also in your city, and the politics that swirl around it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the New York Times, I'm going to sound like the resident Chomskyite, but I'm going to stick with it. I mean, I do think the Times has, at least from a foreign policy point of view, it feels an obligation to support U.S. power and Western power, perhaps maybe in a more, they wanted to see a more liberal version of that in the world, but an American sort of dominance, nevertheless, as opposed to maybe say the Wall Street Journal, which has a more neoconservative, bellicose view of that. But one that favors the Western regime of NATO, of the United States, of the EU, and things like that, and they see that Israel being an extension of that. And I think there's two real good examples to show how I think you can sort of detect that with the Times. In I believe it was 2015, a coalition in Israel called the Joint List, led by the Hadash Party, which is the remnants of the old Palestinian Communist Party, and these other Arab parties came in third in the Knesset elections, and there was a lot of talk in the Western press about how great it was, and that its leader, the leader who's still the leader of the Hadash Party, Ayman Odeh, who's a Palestinian, that he was sort of the great hope of the Palestinians, in part because he was moving his cause electorally, and it sort of validated the Knesset and this idea that change can come from Israeli society from within through its democratic processes. So there was sort of a lifting up of their electoral success of, oh, look how good they did. This is great. This is what they should be doing. But it's sort of like, well, see, they hold free and fair elections over there. Now, fast forward to the last couple of years. Odeh was subject to, I think, several campaigns to have him ousted from the Knesset because of comments that he made about Gaza. Just the other day, he and a colleague were forcibly excused from the Knesset floor. And you see basically none of this in the or not. There's not none of it. I don't want to say that it's completely silent. It's never silent, but just when you take the amount of sort of laudatory pieces that we saw about 10 years ago about his, not just his success, but of the joint list and what they're going through now, it's night and day. And the other example that I would give of this is Greta Thunberg, that she was, when she was campaigning for the environment, for climate change, there were, op-ed after op-ed about, this is how the youth are going to lead. This is how the youth are going to, she was going to Davos, and it was great to have her in Davos and to speak to leaders and to go to the UN, and she came over on a sailboat, and that the minute she's now made one attempt to go to Gaza, and then this past trip in which she was detained along with a lot of other people, the tone is completely shifted. Oh, she's divisive. What do people think of her now? And why has she changed? So that she went from sort of hero to controversial figure. And I think a lot of that just has to do with they're no longer in the service of promoting that Western narrative. Now, you also asked about the local effect, and how they're writing about it here. And I think going back to the first question about things that really bother me about the coverage, I mean, just the limiting of what Jewish opinion can be seen as is extremely extreme. Again, sort of from a Chomskyite view, they sort of limit. There's a range of who they're going to ask, but it's a very limited range in which many people who are flung out of that. And one example of this is when there was an interview with the head of the Anti-Defamation League, a Jewish organization, a Zionist organization, in which the interviewer rightly said, well, aren't there a lot of Jews around the country who are questioning the U.S. role behind Israel? And of course, polling is showing more and more Jewish Americans are skeptical of the Israeli line. And he said, well, who are you asking? He just listed off, if you go to this synagogue, and that Jewish community center, you'll see that they're all behind Israel. And every institution that he mentioned was a Midtown Manhattan synagogue or Jewish community center that is a certain demographic and a certain income bracket. As if everyone else doesn't count, as if Jews in Brooklyn, Jews in Queens, Jews in the Bronx, elsewhere, just their input just doesn't matter. And I think that kind of is, that's more speaks to the world that they're from. I think that you see fewer and fewer. I think it was Mohamad earlier said that you're seeing fewer and you're seeing this consolidation of journalism, and Hadeel said who's actually doing the journalism, and you see a lot fewer working class people rise through the ranks at a place like the New York Times. It's just people who went to Yale and Harvard, and I don't mean to disparage those institutions, but they bring a certain worldview to what the world opinion is. And I think that plays out both internationally and of course back here, how we're viewing these politics. And I mean, if you look at the papers, especially the New York Times, in the last couple of weeks around the mayoral race and how Mamdani and how he's been treated about his positions on Palestine, it's gone from, oh, he's very divisive amongst Jews, to this almost like sigh of resignation. Well, I guess a lot of Jewish people are going to vote for him after all, but they kind of just quite can't say it. And I think that's endemic of that problem.
Let me ask, it's hardly my role to be a defender of legacy media, although obviously I've worked in legacy media for many years. Do any of you take any comfort from any improvement in recent months? We've looked at, some of you, Martin and Mohamad especially, have given us a global perspective from other regions other battles in the Middle East and other countries, but particularly recently on the war in Gaza, I'm thinking of the tabloids around the world and in England of all political persuasions, right and left, started running these photos of starvation. The CBC, in one graphic example, had followed a young boy, and tragically, he eventually died. BBC used satellite footage to show the devastation. And I think it was last week that Guardian documented what it said were the 18,000 children who were killed. So do any of you take any comfort from these examples, and what lessons do you draw from that? Open to anybody who wants to pick it up.
I mean,
No one's going to.
I mean, my answer,
say,
my answer, my answer might be the most cynical, though I think probably most realistic, which is that there has been a noticeable shift, and it's worth analyzing why it's happened. And that shift has included more humane treatment of
Yes.
Palestinians undergoing starvation. My sense of why that shift happened isn't because of some kind of um, sudden realization among the top tiers of media managers and editors in Western newspapers and outlets. It has more to do, again, I think, with the media moving in lockstep with government and corporate power. And I do think that this summer was a shift among Western governments, especially in Canada, France, and the UK, and to some degree in the US, though not at the top, obviously, that what Israel was doing was going a bit too far. There, I think, wasn't a substantial disagreement with the end goals of the Israeli government, but there was, I think, growing discomfort about the tactics that Israel was using. And I think you saw in the media a bit more space open up to criticize some of the means to the ends that Israel was pursuing. And so you saw more coverage, critical coverage of the starvation regime that had been imposed on Gaza. You saw opinion editorials coming out explicitly critical about Israel's tactics. I remember one editorial in the Globe and Mail in Canada, which is our paper of record, comparable to the New York Times, in which the Globe's editorial desk, and this was the title of the piece, that Israel must stop helping Hamas to win, which was essentially not a principled criticism about what Israel was doing, but a concern that the starvation tactics were not helping their cause. And so I think as a result of that kind of growing body of tactical, not principled criticism of Israel's genocide, there was more space that opened up for journalists to cover with greater accuracy what Israel's been doing. But I don't think, I mean, to echo Mohamad, that to me is not a sign of some kind of more fundamental shift that I think, would bode well for continuing coverage of what's unfolding in Gaza.
Mohamad, all the examples
Yeah.
I gave, I was just going to say, are from outside of America. Are you seeing the same improvement in the American media landscape?
I agree with all of those. I agree with pretty much everything Martin offered up as an explanation, and I wouldn't call it an improvement. I mean, I guess in some ways it's an improvement, but it's almost an enforced improvement in that I would add to the structural reasons that Martin laid out for this. I would also add maybe some attempt to bridge the disconnect between what people were seeing on social media and other sort of more immediate ways that Palestinians were able to reach the world and convey through the incredible bravery of Palestinian journalists who've been targeted and systematically murdered in this war. So through that effort, we were able to see a lot of what was going on in Gaza, despite the systematic failures of the media. And I think one part of that, especially on that wave of stories around starvation and around famine and coinciding with the IPC's declaration of famine in northern Gaza, at least, we saw that that improvement in that we saw coverage that was reflecting a bit more of the reality. But in some ways, I think the gatekeepers had to be dragged kicking and screaming to do that, to get that across, and as to not lose complete legitimacy. And it helped that the political moment changed a bit, in allowing a bit more breathing space for criticism of Israeli policies.
Let's try to end on, if not a positive note, at least to offer some solutions. I think, we've seen how the war in Gaza and the media coverage has led to some pretty ugly examples of racism. We saw the anti-Semitic terror attack at the Manchester synagogue in England recently, other attacks on Jewish institutions in Canada, and there have been many ugly displays of Islamophobia, many firings in universities and elsewhere for people who have spoken out on Gaza and reacted to media stories. So let me ask each of you what you think can be done, leaving aside budgets and everything else. If you had not even a magic wand, what can be done today? What can people watching and listening to this, what can be done to change and improve the coverage? Let's go through each of you. Hadeel, what would be your hope or suggestions?
I mean, this is a tough question because, like we've heard, these are systemic issues that are like deeper than just like, oh, let's make sure that we have better, trained journalists or better,
more money,
anything. I don't know that I'm not really sure what can make. I can only speak to, we can talk about the umbrella. I can only really speak to my experience and the experience of the journalists that I see working on the ground every day there. When I go to a press conference or when I'm at a front line, or I can only speak to the fact that, a lot of these people are good people who are trying to tell a very difficult story under very difficult circumstances with very difficult editorial decision, leaderships, and also difficult resources. And then also, I think one aspect of news consumption that we haven't really talked too much about that I think plays a role also, which I don't know what we can do about, is also what the audiences are telling us they want to hear.
Very good point.
We're, NPR at least and other organizations have done very extensive studies on what people want. And a lot of times people don't want the stories that people like me are writing or putting out there. And so maybe some sort of shift in the culture needs to happen also, so that they tell us, actually, no, we want more stories of people in that region, etc. Like people are telling us that they want more stories about health and wellness and joy and God knows what, and that also makes our work harder to convince people to read it. Not a very good answer, but those are sort of the things that you have to like.
No, but it's a good point to raise, to put some of the onus on the audience. People have mentioned the internet and alternative sources and how that's both helped and maybe pressured the media. Any suggestions from any of you? And we will post these links tomorrow on the CFE website. Any suggestions for good social media or alternative news sources to go to?
I think, there's a lot of the common, answers that people are going to throw out, like Al Jazeera, the 972, which are, that are both in English. I think one thing that I was thinking about in terms of hope for the future, I was thinking about where we were during the Iraq War, and a lot of Americans were they were distrustful of American media. So it was like, oh, get online, read the Guardian, read Al Jazeera, read the BBC, all these things. And I grew up, listening to English language service on shortwave radio, all these different radio from all over the world to try to get as many, perspectives as I possibly could. And I'm wondering if there's something in the future of news. We used to poo-poo news aggregation because it was just taking the work of other journalists and having it published and just kind of regurgitating, and it wasn't, really new or interesting. But I think maybe there's a place for something for translators and people, taking media from all over the world and translating into English for English language speakers to see what's happening from other parts of the world. I mean, I think we mentioned when we were talking last, when I had a friend in Italy who was sending me all these articles from the Italian press about what was going on with the marches and the strikes that were related to the flotilla. They were all Italian. I thought, well, I can't read this, but I threw it into Google Translate. And it took a little bit of work, but if there was more systematic of taking these things from other languages and making it more widely available, I think that could be a huge help.
All right. We have a few questions I want to go to, but Mohamad or Martin, quickly, do you have any thoughts on solutions or possible ways to improve the coverage?
Well, I think we've seen, at least in Canada, and I think this is happening elsewhere around the world, on the question of Palestine and on so many issues, there's been a bit of a renaissance of independent media. And I do think that independent media outlets that are accountable to their readers, not to their, advertisers or corporate owners, is a crucial way to tilt the balance of coverage. And I know for a fact that in Canada here, mainstream people working in legacy outlets have told me that our coverage, when it scoops their own outlets, does create openings for them to be able to do more of the kind of accurate, critical reporting that they want to do and feel pressured often not to do. And I also think there's been an incredible, the incredible uprising of movements for Palestinian solidarity has also, I think, created an incredible countervailing pressure on media, especially legacy media outlets. And I think their legitimacy has been put into question in a way, I think, that will push people within there, especially in the upper rungs, to shift slowly. I think popular movements, do have a kind of civilizing effect in that they change the culture. And I think the deepening awareness of anti-Palestinian racism that exists in our societies and the injustices of U.S. foreign policy, I think will, in the medium term, lead to important shifts with respect to how the Western media covers what's unfolding in Israel and Palestine.
Interesting. And to go back to where we started when Hadeel and others raised the problem of this monolithic view, right? Monolithic view of the Arab world, monolithic view of the Jewish world. I think what one possible path too is to see now through the internet, through social media, through translation, it's possible to have access to the dissenting voices in Israel, the dissenting voices in the Arab world, Arab media and journalists who are critical of their own leaders, their own political movements. So
I
that
feel
maybe gives us some hope.
some of the best war on Gaza coverage has come out of Haaretz, in Israel right now. I feel like they have become one of the leaders in breaking news and criticizing the government. In fact, there's a bit of a joke on the ground there that, whenever Haaretz breaks a story, New York Times goes and does it. So lots of the stories in the New York Times was actually reported in the Haaretz first. So I would put that on the top of the list of a list of news outlets to consume.
All right, let's turn to some questions. Ange, do you want to read the first question and let us know if it's directed to anybody in particular or anybody in the panel? We have about, we don't have to end at 8:30, but we have about 20 minutes for the questions. Go ahead, Ange.
Yeah, the first question from an attendee, they ask, how can Western mainstream media give their readers good accounts of what is happening in Gaza when Israel refuses to allow any outside journalists into Gaza?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. And I think that one of the failures of Western legacy media is that we didn't consolidate right from the beginning of the war 2 years ago to force the Israeli government to let us in. Like there was and a lot of us actually look back and we're like, why didn't our bosses, our editors, our mastheads get together and do this, forceful push? And there's always that, the Israeli government's, excuse is like, oh, it's too dangerous. Well, that's our decision to make. We've been in very dangerous places, but I think that's a failure of our leaderships in our
I was
legacy.
struck this week how many competing media joined together to refuse the American Pentagon's new restrictive rules. And it wasn't a complete boycott, but they're cutting off their own noses. They're saying, no, we will voluntarily leave rather than accept your, and we didn't see that same kind of forcefulness. Can I ask any of you, it's been a week, we're seeing a slow trickle of aid. Has there been any talk since, in principle, we're supposed to see a normalization of the situation? Has there been any talk of letting foreign journalists, and not just foreign journalists, Israeli journalists, Arab journalists, any talk of opening up Gaza so we can see firsthand from all political point of views? Send in the real journalists, Mohamad?
I don't think there's been any progress. I know that the Foreign Press Association in Israel has filed. I think they're in the middle of their second lawsuit, and it's reached the Israeli Supreme Court. I know that CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, was filing a brief. They might have done it today on that. And yes, I mean obviously that's a huge. It's been a huge restriction on this. The one thing I would point out is that Palestinian journalists, again, I'll say, have done an incredible job, and in many ways, there is this goes back to one of Martin's initial points about it's connected to the dehumanization. There's really no reason that we should not regard what the journalism that Palestinian journalists produce from the ground for many of these organizations, including Western legacy ones, shouldn't be seen as anything less than what a Western
Absolutely.
correspondent would do. And in many cases, when the Western correspondents eventually go in, they're going to have to rely on the local Palestinian journalists to be their fixers and translators and to get them around. So this veneer of putting a Western spin, of putting the kind of white spin on it, as Hadeel pointed out, it's not, I don't think it gains that much. So I'm a little reluctant. I think
Excellent
legacy
point.
media should have pushed harder on this for sure, and they should continue to push harder. This is the moment to do that. But I think there's been a little bit of hiding behind that fact. The Palestinian journalists who've produced consistent, almost around the clock coverage on Al Jazeera. No one in Al Jazeera, in the hierarchy of Al Jazeera, questions their commitment to journalism. And Al Jazeera Arabic certainly produces it has a different approach than Al Jazeera English, has a different approach than the BBC for sure. But those journalists have conveyed. I've watched many hours of Al Jazeera Arabic coverage and English coverage as well. But over the summer, I was in Beirut for a few weeks, and I saw Anas Sharif's coverage, and in different social contexts, in different places, and you could tell he had developed a bond with viewers in the Arab world, in the so-called Arab street, in one version of the street, in one segment of that street, and I think ultimately that was one of the reasons he was targeted and killed by Israel, is that he had developed that bond and that trust. And he was as great of a journalist as they come.
And we should mention those journalists that you quite rightly praise. So many of them have paid the ultimate cost. Every reputable human rights and media human rights organization has documented the unprecedented toll of the killing of the journalists who gave their lives. Next question.
Yeah, the next question, an attendee says, as a kid, the person who I felt and still do personified good journalism was an American journalist, I.F. Stone. He felt his success was rooted in a deep skepticism of authority and a commitment to independent, in-depth research rather than relying on official sources. Is there any time and space for this approach to journalism in today's media world?
Excellent question. One of my heroes, Ari.
I mean, it's harder and harder. I mean, one of the things that I have still, I mean, everyone remember, well, there's many things that people remember of I have Stone, but was his own newsletter. And there's a whole host of people now, just they're leaving their jobs in news, or they're no longer freelancing, and they're just going to Substack and creating their own newsletters. And sometimes I think there's great value to that if they can't get their stuff out there through the usual channels. Why not take it to Substack? On the other hand, you don't have that same kind of backing. You don't, if you're going to do investigative reporting, you need, I mean, you do need money, you do need time, and so you need to not be encumbered with a day job to work during the day and then do your journalism at night. You need legal protection to protect yourself from lawsuits, because there's been a huge uptick in organizations going after investigative journalism with quote unquote slap lawsuits. So it's becoming like I do, there are these good journalists who go out there and they create a Substack, and they make some money, but it's like the whole is worth more than the sum of its parts. I wish you could take some of those and bring them together and know that it's not just you need a couple of good writers. You also need good fact checkers, and you need good translators and people, and I see Hadeel nodding, and there are people behind the scenes, people who book your flights and your hotels, and like these people are important. And when you travel and do that kind of stuff, and they're no less journalists than the people whose bylines you see. And so I think there's a lot of that behind the scenes. And it's like, wow, why don't you just go start a Substack? So I think there's some of that, but I still believe that there needs to be some kind of that organization. It's going to take money and it's going to take dedication. I don't know where to get that money from now, because I know that in the case of NPR, that in PBS, with the loss of the Corporate Broadcasting Corporation, that the Knight Foundation and I believe the Ford Foundation, a couple of other foundations, stepped in to fund to fill that hole, and that's great. But then that's money that isn't going to some of these smaller upstarts. So it's going to be.
To speak to your point, Ari, I was in covering the war in Gaza from Israel for the past 14 months, and I was brought back 2 months ago because they ran out of money.
Yeah.
So what's happening is that journalists who know the story, who understand things, who get it, who speak the language. This is what I mean by being shackled by resources and by the way that the media landscape is today. They will pull people who get it away from the story because they just can't afford it anymore. And then also there's the added stress of things that are happening, like CBS, where Barry Weiss is taking over of certain kind of background that is, and entire organizations are being upheaved because leadership changes.
Sorry, go ahead, Mohamad.
I just want to jump in and share. There are many lessons journalists can learn from I.F. Stone, especially younger journalists. I would argue the best lesson to learn is his very famous quote that all governments lie. So if you want to take I.F. Stone to heart, you look up the rest of that quote if you're interested. There's more interesting aspects to it, but that quote that and he's not saying, I.F. Stone wasn't saying that all governments lie all the time, or that nothing a government says should ever be believed, but he was saying this very central element for journalistic the pursuit, which is that you should not assume just because a government official says something that it's automatically true. And one of the huge failings of the past 2 years we've seen is too many legacy media outlets taking the statements of Israeli government and military officials at face value.
To build on that,
I would just add as a sequel to that, the other great quote from Claude Coburn, which is "Don't believe anything until it's officially denied," which I just love.
I think a riff on all that, going back to the question I asked about access to journalists from around the world so that we can help the Palestinian journalists who are there, is that, everything people have just said, if you have the support and the power of some of the powerful media organizations, think of the coverage, when Canadian journalists were able to go outside the wire, not rely on the Canadian army, and investigate what was really going on in Afghanistan. We saw it in Vietnam as well with some of the brave coverage, certainly the Iraq War. And I think that's what we have not. I mean, the Palestinian journalists have been struggling just to, one, stay alive and recount the horrors going on. But what we need are, the powerful media organizations from around the world, Israel, the Arab world, the Western world, going into Gaza and investigating the same way we were able to investigate every other war. And if you think of the huge revelations that came up, I think it could be monumental. Ange, I think we have time for a few more questions. Next.
Yeah, the next question is from Samir. And Samir says, unlike general workers, journalists know how their product is going to be distributed. Why shouldn't they be fully accountable for misrepresentations?
I'm not quite sure if he means when their stuff gets changed by editors or not. Hadeel, do you want to try? I'm
Yeah,
not.
you should I should. The thing is, whenever I put a story out, I make sure it's my name at the end of the day. So I make sure that every single word I can stand behind. So yes, I should be I should be accountable for my work out there. I'm not sure like what the person means exactly in terms of like punishment, or I don't know, but like yes, if the work is wrong, you get the shame of a correction.
Although I guess part of what often happens is, most certainly in both broadcast and certainly in print or online, journalists are often not the people who write the headlines, which can often be quite,
And
distorting or passive,
absolutely.
right? And there
And
are editing,
that's
that
happened
goes
to me,
on.
and then that's why you have to you fight back. I mean, you can
Mhm.
you can if you want like a journalist. I can, as a journalist who writes a story, I can only do so much, but I can also
Mm.
raise as much as I can within the organization, and like play the politics of the organization. You will lose sometimes, but then there will be times where you win.
Mhm. And next question.
Yeah, the next question is from Emily, and Emily asks, "What advice do panelists have for the journalists within legacy media who are trying to influence those gatekeepers toward better coverage while keeping their jobs?"
The last few words are important. Well, I guess to some degree, Hadil, you have to start with
I
that.
think I
Um,
think you pick your battles.
mm,
I think that there's going to be there's so many in a legacy media organization that you're going to take you know take sometimes offense to, take feel very bad about, feel defeated, especially if you're a journalist of color, a journalist with a name like mine. um, you're going to feel broken a lot of times, but then you have to pick your battles, and you have to decide, okay, this is the one that really matters right now, because if somebody reads it, they need to know, the outcome needs to be XYZ. So you pick your battles, you be patient. I think, a lot of us during this time, especially with the war on Gaza, a lot of, journalists of color, people, that are like me, have sat down together and had very difficult conversations with each other. Like, do we belong in legacy media? Um, do we belong here? Should we be giving our time and our efforts and all of that kind of stuff and our expertise to legacy media? A lot of people have decided, some people I know have like completely given up and they want to leave. They can't take it. My point of view has always been, I'm trying to do what I can, as much as I can, within an organization and organizations that at the end of the day get more eyes than a Substack. I think I am much more useful at NPR than a Substack, or even at an independent news organization or something like that. At the end of the day, I have a point of view that I think, with this picking of the battles, that I think is just much more useful. This is how I want to contribute to telling the story.
Oh my God, stay there, Hadeel. We need more Hadeels, not fewer. And any more questions?
Yeah, there's a few more. The next one is from Susie, and Susie says, "Thank you for this very informative discussion. Are there specific stories that you feel need to be covered in this next phase of the conflict in Gaza, which are at risk of being sidelined?"
That's a good question. Any of you jump in. As Hadeel pointed out, we've been in the last week in the rush of news. It's quite dramatic, but now is the time for some deep-seated analysis. What kind of stories, what kind of questions, what kind of stories would you like to see from either legacy media or other forms? Anybody jump in? What do you want to see reported?
I mean, one quick one I would say is I think this has been the case over the last 2 years with the focus on Gaza, which I think is entirely understandable, but there is a slow motion ethnic cleansing underway in the West Bank, and a heightened settler violence encouraged by the Israeli government, and I do think in many ways that is the next zone of interest for the Israeli government, and I think most Western outlets have not covered it with the scrutiny that it deserves.
Interesting. Mohamad, what would be on the top of your wish list?
Um, I'd be interested in seeing more analysis on on this question of what next in Gaza, what the governance structure looks like, whether there's so many. We've seen some decent coverage of the pitfalls of the kind of foreign-led administration, the Tony Blair type of almost a coalition provisional authority, to hark back to the Iraq occupation, but some deeper coverage of what governance in Gaza looks like, of what there are a lot of challenges to disarming Hamas, just as there are a lot of challenges to disarming Hezbollah in Lebanon, but those have been now set, and I think partly because one of the weaknesses in coverage, and sorry to keep harking back on weaknesses, is that the ceasefire in Lebanon has essentially failed, and it's failed because Israel gets to violate the ceasefire every day, with very little repercussions, and with very little. There are countries, the U.S. and France, among them, being the guarantors of that ceasefire, and I mean. And I don't say this lightly. There's been something like 4,000 attacks. Since November of 2024, and that, if that's the model for Gaza, then we're in real trouble. Then the ceasefire is not going to hold in any meaningful way. Now, maybe if there's a slim ray of hope on this, is if Trump seems to have gotten himself personally vested in the Gaza ceasefire, there might be ways to exploit that, in that he wouldn't want to see it collapse or falter.
Anybody else have a wish list, or can we take the next question? Ari,
I
did you
think,
have?
yeah, I mean, I think we're going to have to dig pretty deeply about what it is the U.S. wants to get out of this whole, this whole thing. I mean, I think we've established that the U.S. has had a long relationship with Israel and wants to see it extending U.S. power and Western power. But what is it that Trump wants to build casinos in Gaza? Is it that he is embedded with a very messianic version of Christianity that sees the entirety of Eretz Israel as this final frontier towards the end times, and is sort of, there was a time when people sort of laughed at all that. They'd be like, oh yeah, a couple of people believe that, but that's not really important. I mean, there are now people like that very squarely in the center of DC policy making, and I think it's going to take some probing to see what it is that, and to go back to Martin's point, I mean, just the settler violence. I mean, I think a lot of they're viewed as sort of part of the front lines of that messianic war. So I think as fantastic as it sounds, I think we're going to have to really look at what it is the U.S. is trying to get out of all this.
I want to look into more of the Gulf's role also in this. Like they, Trump is really all about the art of the deal, and he believed that he art of the deal this with the Gulf. And so where does Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, they all stand in this, and what are the consequences actually of this deal?
We're going to try to wrap in a couple of minutes. Angie, time for one last question.
Yeah, the one last question is from Ali. Hi, they say you criticize the coverage of legacy media. So how do you see the threat of Netanyahu to sue the New York Times for one of the Gaza starvation stories, for example?
Ari, you want to?
Yeah, at FAIR, we've written a lot about these types of suits. I mean, I know that, for example, Trump just sued the New York Times for some comical number, like $15 billion that was immediately tossed. I mean, I think these big legacy, I mean, the papers like the Times, I think, can sort of just put their lawyers on it and fight it, and they've successfully fought most of these things. I think where these lawsuits have been the most dangerous has been in the broadcast sector, because it invokes the FCC. That in both the CBS case and the ABC case, it was like, you better settle or else this deal's not going to go through. And that, we talked a little bit earlier, Mohamad talked a little bit earlier about what's happening at CBS. I mean, all this was put into play because the FCC said, if you don't pay out because of what you said on 60 Minutes, then this Paramount deal with Skydance isn't going to happen. And the amount of just paying whatever it was, like 10 million, 20 million is like a drop in the bucket, with the billions that were wrapped up in that deal. So from their perspective, that was just the cost of doing business. So I don't really see it really being a monetary scare for the Times right now. I do worry, I mean, it's interesting because it's coming from Netanyahu. There have been attempts by other conservative actors and right-wing actors to sue the Times and other newspapers for defamation. We do have Supreme Court precedent to protect journalism. Now, it's called the Sullivan ruling from the Sullivan versus New York Times case. There's been a lot of jurisprudence, I think, especially from Clarence Thomas and others, that want to undo that. It's one of the many Supreme Court precedents that the right wants to undo, and it would very much hinder American journalism. I don't think this Netanyahu case is going to do it, but I think it's a part of a whole sort of matrix of legal action against places like the Times that I think are going after that protection.
Let me end by using this question to promote a next panel we're trying to work on for 2027 in the media stream of CFE, which will look at the corporate concentration of the media in America. And using Netanyahu as an example, I was struck by the fact that the Prime Minister of Israel, I believe, if the reporting was accurate, openly praised the prospect of Larry Ellison, who has taken over and building a media empire, being one of the potential owners of TikTok. So the fact that you have a foreign leader saying this could be good for me raises a lot of interesting points. And we hope to make that corporate concentration a topic of a future panel. On that note, I'd like to thank our panelists and hand things back to Jim Turk. Over to you, Jim.
I'm coming. It's for some reason my camera isn't. There we go. I want to thank all the members of the panel and the moderator. I thought that was a terrific discussion. The insights and different perspectives you brought, and I'm sure we could have talked for much longer than we did. So we're very grateful to each of you. We know how busy you are, and we're thankful that you spent the time with us. And to the audience, thank you for your questions, and thank you for coming tonight. We're going to have more events, as Julian has indicated. To see the events that CFE puts on, just go to our website, which is cfe.torontomu.ca. Also tomorrow, we're going to post a video of this panel, along with some additional readings and resources for those of you who got interested in issues that they raised. And so the panelists will make suggestions of material that will be there for you to dig deeper into some of the questions or see some of the documents or writers or others to whom they referred. So with that, thank you all very much. Good night.
Good night, all. Stay
Thank you.
safe, everyone. If I could just make just a final note, if you don't mind, Jim.
No, go ahead.
I was struck by how, look, this issue, particularly the war in the last couple of years, has raised huge amount of emotions. I've never seen journalists that I know personally feeling ripped apart by some of the debates. Hadeel, I'm sure you've experienced the same thing. And I think what this panel, what we try to do here is whatever your political views are, whatever your emotions are, sure, keep them, fight for them, but also try to put them aside. Look at alternative sources of views. Look at what these journalists that we have here and the sources they've look at the facts that they're trying to represent. And we don't have to come to an agreement. It's not a kumbaya moment we're talking about, but we're talking about the future of many peoples and the world. And we need independent journalism to bring these facts to you. So please support the work of the people you see here and your favorite news outlets. And stay safe, everyone. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Good closing comment.
Bye-bye, everyone.